This is Duke University.
I very much appreciate the opportunity to share with you my thinking about and how to present this book. It's the first time that I'm actually presenting this kind of a talk about the book. So what I'm going to do is, it's built on a book, but the issues I want to raise are also much more generic kind of issues, the more fundamental issues. There are people now, including myself, who claim that no transforming economy, by the way, we're using the word transforming instead of emerging, just in case you're not on the latest wave of the right terminology. So there's not been ever, there's basically never been transforming economies that became high-income economies without also adopting liberal democratic principles. So how did I get into this? I have to tell you a little bit about that. Well, for many years, I've been the director of CYBER, the Center for International Education, Business, and Research. And then as I was approaching retirement, my dean decided that the Fuqua school is not going to reapply for the CYBER, which was okay. You know, the school has a different strategy now. And but all of this occurs just about the time that I'm actually developing interest in China, which I will come to later. And so I'm becoming emeritus, and I get this letter from this society called the International Association for Chinese Management Research, IACMR, where the board is asking me to consider taking on the job of editor-in-chief of their journal, Management Organization Review, MOR. And the dilemma was this. The woman who started IACMR, who started the journal, who took it from, the journal is already in its 12th year, so it's already quite an established journal. Her name is Anne Tsui. I called her up in 1981 when she was coming out with her PhD from UCLA to take a job at Duke. She came to us as an assistant professor and then left us to go to California. But she basically became a very famous scholar and also president of the Academy of Management and on and on and on. And you know, when she says, "I'd like you to be to follow me as editor-in-chief of MOR," there was really no way I could say no. So okay, so I took the job. I only had one condition. The condition was that we are not focus on China anymore, solely on China, but we will focus on all transforming economies. And that's the one change that I've made. And then, as a way of educating myself, I repeated something that I've done many times with other journals, and I'm going back to creating the journal Organization Science. I don't know how many of you know Organization Science, but it's certainly now the absolutely best journal in the social sciences that have to do with management and organizations. And what we used to do, in order to identify emergent issues and topics of interest, we created something called the Organization Science Winter Conference, which was at a ski resort, since I like to ski. And it was basically created as a very elitist, by invitation only conference, but the idea was that you brought people together who would push on the frontier of ideas, and maybe the journal would then have an idea for a special issue or some other conferences or whatever. So I decided to do this again for MOR, and what happened is that the book that we're talking about basically originates from the first MOR Research Frontier Conference that was hosted by HUST, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and the business school at HUST. Okay. When we did the conference, I had no idea, none whatsoever, that I would discover this theme in that conference and would eventually create the book. So it is, in many ways, just pure luck. Just a little bit about this map. I think you all know this. But all the wealth creation in China occurs along the southern side of China, with a few exceptions. One exception is Chongqing, and another one is up here in Dalian, right here. And these are points I'm going to come back to later on. I just want you to sort of keep that in mind. I can also tell you all the places I've been to in China. Xi'an, of course, Shanghai, Beijing, Dalian, Ningbo on my recent trip, Hangzhou, Shenzhen, of course, Chengdu. So as part of all of this, I've also basically tried to understand what goes on in the life of people. And one of the things that I do regularly is I take a student and ask the student at night, after 8 o'clock in the evening, we go to, these huge residential towers, and we count the number of lights in the window, how many windows are lit. What do you think, what's the proportion of windows that are lit on average? All of them? 10%. Very close. So it's around 10%. The question is, what's going on? One of the things that's going on is that people own multiple apartments that they don't live in and they don't rent out. Okay, so that's one of those things that will come back in this talk. Anyway, the book has 16 chapters. I'm not going to go through them right now. I feel extremely fortuitous, lucky, that the book is coming out at a time that China is in the headlines almost every day. And the news at the beginning seemed surprising. How can this miracle economy suddenly find itself in all of these difficulties? And secondly, what can we say about that? So, just to summarize, miracle growth, amazing, right? 10% since 1978 each year. Officially, this last year was only 7%, and the hand-wringing that's going on about this is absolutely amazing. If you're in any place in China, we can talk about these things. We should, however, remember that this huge wealth creation was very unequal. China has if not the largest, the second or third largest gap in terms of how this was, in terms of equality of wealth. If you want to see an academic paper about it, go to the Journal of International Business Studies. There's a fantastic paper that took 120 countries around the world and with some very interesting mathematics and a new methodology of analysis called the fuzzy set theory, CA, comparative analysis, showed that China is among the very lowest countries in terms of the equality of wealth creation. Okay? This by itself has the seeds of a lot of problems, so it's very important to keep that in mind. What were the engines of growth? You may know all of this, but I just want to repeat it. China followed the classic model. It was to become an export-driven economy. But how do you take an agrarian, over 80% of the population living on the land in 1978, and make it an industrial economy? Well, in my life, I've been lucky many, many times, and this time luck came in again. It turned out that a very well-known Chinese economist by the name of Justin Yifulin. How many of you know who Yifulin is? In China, he is famous for what? At the age of 26, he swam across from Taiwan to China to join the Communist Party. So every Chinese kid knows about Yifulin. He was then sent to Chicago to learn economics. And guess what? He shows up at Duke University as an assistant professor after he got his PhD, just at that time when I'm the head of the Duke faculty, 1982 to 1986. And I just happened to know him because we were in the same building. At any rate, he then just to finish his story. Hey, how are you? just to finish the story here, when Zhu Rongji was prime minister, he snatched Yi Fulin from Duke, took him back to China, established him at Peking University, created the Center for Economic Research or something like that, and Center for Economic Research and Development. And it is Yi Fulin who conceives of the policy of creating surplus labor in agriculture. Without creating surplus labor in agriculture, we would have never had that huge buildup of the factory of the world. He basically created an incentive system so that the people who were in these cooperatives working their fields would suddenly say, well, we actually don't need so many people. A few of you are not sharing anymore because he created a quota plus a share above quota. And so these Chinese would begin to sort of get together, and because of personalism and other reasons, and they begin to exclude people from participating in sharing the spoils of the profits above quota. And what I find difficult to explain is that these people who were left out then start to migrate to the free economic zones that they started creating right after 1978. And it's those people who are then toiling away in those factories and basically are able to begin this huge transition to an export and manufacturing export economy with very low labor costs. And I don't know that it was never clear to me as to all the sacrifices that people make, because in China you have what's called the Fuqua system, the registration system. You're registered in a particular city. And if you leave that city and you go to another city, you don't have claim on social benefits, your kids can't go to school, you don't have any health care. You can only get those services in those days, even to this day, in the city in which you're registered. Yet these people, these migrants, migrate to these cities with no services, treated like the worst, lowest level people in that location. This year, the peak of these migrants is around 350 million people. And if you happen to be in China on Chinese New Year, these are the people who go once a year, travel all over China, go back to the villages, families, wherever they are, to be with their family one time a year. When I go to Shanghai Jiatong, there's a lady, Zhu Lan, her name. She works in this university. It's one of the top universities in China. And she sees her family once a year during the 10 days of the Chinese New Year. I'm giving you all of this just to give you an idea what we mean by the two engines of growth. So far, I've talked about the first engine of growth, which was creating the surplus labor and becoming the factory of the world over a relatively short period of time. The second one is the huge investment in infrastructure. China was very fortunate because as the export economy generates returns, it increases the reserves of the country, combine it with a very high savings rate, and the government basically had a huge source of resources for making investment in infrastructure. So if you go to China and then you go to India or vice versa, and you sort of wonder about where did all these roads come from, where did the railroads come from, where did the airports come from, where did all this housing come from, all of this was the investment in infrastructure. Okay? But at some point, which is now happening, there is no more flow of migrants from the rural economy to the factories. It's finished. It's down to nothing. And after such a huge binge of infrastructure investment, additional infrastructure investment only has a much smaller impact on the economy in terms of job creation and so forth. And in fact, they already overdone it. You know, we used to laugh about California and bridges that don't go anywhere and roads that stop in the middle. Well, they have all of that, plus airports that only see a plane once a month, and on and on and on and on. So they know. And so this book happens to then basically ask this following question. Assuming that the current leadership, the Communist Party, is not relinquishing its control of the economy, therefore no democracy, can China overcome the middle income trap? Okay. And the last point here, for them to overcome the middle income trap is, as I will show later on, is to become an innovation economy. They understand that to become a high-income economy, you're going to have to somehow benefit from the payoff that comes from being an innovation economy. Okay, so that is the question that we're looking at. I'm not going to go through all these headlines. I just want to be sure that you sort of understand what's happening. 2014, the China economy on a purchase power parity calculation is equal to the US. Why is it equal? Because 1.3 billion people, even though it's lower income, basically are creating an economy of our size. This year, we suddenly see that the Shanghai Stock Exchange has had a meltdown. It's more than 40% off its peaks. But why was it at such a peak? Because someplace along the way, the government said, oh, you know, we have to find an alternative for where people can invest their money. Because after 3, 4, 6 extra apartments, the apartment is not the place to go. And so, here we have all these new startups and IPOs and the stock exchange, and the government basically induced people to invest in stocks and allowed very low margin requirements. In other words, you could leverage your investment in stocks. Well, it went great. Only thing is that eventually this bubble burst, and the victims, the people who lost money, are mostly small Chinese families, individuals. It's not investment banks, it's not international mutual funds and so forth, who did not invest directly in the stock exchange. That when the foreign capital invested through Hong Kong, on the Hong Kong exchange, and therefore could pull out their money. So the point here is the impact was mainly felt by Chinese citizens. Of course, other people are saying, hey, you can't grow 10% forever. So at some point, they should have stopped anyway, and we should not be surprised that they are not able to keep pulling it off. And that's probably true. I find it interesting that Prime Minister Li Qiang, I just learned it on my last trip, he has his own way of tracking the index of growth, and he looks at electricity production, railway freight, bank loan growth, and not at GDP growth. And he comes up with a growth estimate that is 3% lower than the official rate for this year, which is 7%. Now, don't ask me how you find out things like that. I will just give you one small hint. Everything is by accident, because people introduce you, and if without these introductions, you cannot go anyplace. Anyway, I'm at a dinner, and I'm introduced to the woman who is responsible for the training of the senior cadre of the Communist Party. In 2014, it was all about corruption. I'll come back to that. This last year, it was all about local responsiveness. These two items are very important because they are directly related to Communist Party ability to have social legitimacy. I'll skip that. Basically, what you have here is that people are arguing about why the economy is declining. And one of the things that is very true is that for some time now, the Chinese economy is shifting from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. And when you shift to a service economy, rate of growth is lower and the rate of returns are lower. And so that, as this guy explains, Nicolas Lardy, is his explanation for the decline in China. In that conference that I mentioned that gave birth to this book, there was a lot of discussion and arguments, and the statement was made over and over and over again by people that no emergent economy, I should have put the word transforming economy there, I'm so sorry. Emergent is out, remember, it's transforming. No transforming economy has been able to grow its economy beyond the middle income trap. Okay? And by the way, in connection with this, you should know that, because I'm making the case that the leadership in China knows very clearly that they are into this challenge, because they co-sponsored with the World Bank in 2013 a report. The State Council and the World Bank published a joint report which anticipated that China will hit the middle income trap in 2030 and will not be able to grow out of it. Okay? So it's not like they don't know that it's coming. So this book is basically about, are they doomed, or they might be able to surprise us? And basically, these points are only about how challenging this is going to be. You have 350 million people who are in the migrant population. The population is aging, so that means that the cost of social welfare and healthcare and so forth are increasing. You probably noticed in the news that while I was in China this last time, that the government or the State Council now allows families to have 2 children, because long term they can see that they're going to need to deal with that. And maybe that'll solve it, but if you talk to young couples on the street or visit with them, I mean, I'm talking about cities like Beijing or Shanghai or Hangzhou or Shenzhen or places like that. These couples have no interest in having 2 children because it's already so expensive. But, I mean, that's what they tell you. We're at the time when there's diminishing returns to investment in infrastructure, and the cities, the big cities, are already beyond their ability to really handle increase in population. So you must find ways for new cities, you must find other ways to accommodate the movement into the rural to urban movement, and that's all of that is on the plate. Okay, we should understand that the Chinese leadership is totally aware and sensitive to the fact that the 2 growth models, the 2 engines of growth, have finished. If you study the 5-year plan, the 2015 plan, and then you look at what is adopted in 2013, they're already adopting policies that anticipate all of that, right? For example, they understand that one of the sources of uncertainty and why people save so much money has to do with the fact that there's insecurity about land ownership, owning your apartment. You never know whether when you invest in the stock market you're going to have returns that's manipulated. You don't know if your kids is going to be able to go to the best school or not, and so all of these are the things that create insecurity. And if you're a businessman and you want to invent something, you don't know what will be the protection for your intellectual property in all kinds of different ways. And so all of these things are known to them, and they're beginning to institute initiatives that will create a definition about your rights that you can expect when a local government confiscates your land. I found the most interesting is that they're finally attacking the Fuqua system. In other words, that you'll be able to get your benefits and education and healthcare no matter where you are in China, and it does not matter what city you were originally registered in. That by itself is a huge change. They claim that they're going to let market the dynamics select winners and losers, and they want to do that. They claim that they're going to decrease the role of the state-owned enterprises. These are all topics I'm going to come back to. They need to change the healthcare system, the social security system, and a different tax system. This is a huge topic which has to do with what does it take to do business in China? There are many, many, many what we call transaction costs in the system. Many people have to approve, and all these things that you have to do. Just to give you an idea, when I opened my bank account, because university they don't give you the money to pay your travel expenses. You have to first put in the bank, and then you're going to. Not only did it take an hour and a half, but it was a sheaf of paper, and I'm not exaggerating, like this. I have no idea what I was filling in and signing all the time. Transaction costs. Same thing for getting the mobile phone. So transaction costs are a huge problem. And that creates inefficiencies in the economy and slows down innovation, slows down all of these kind of things. Now they know, the point is, they know all of this. And now you also have the fact that one of the costs that they deliberately overlooked, there's no criticism. I can understand perfectly why, as you're growing your economy, becoming a manufacturing economy, you rape the environment, you pollute, all of this stuff. But now they recognize that they have to do something about it, at least publicly. We know that they do that. And that is not a small challenge by itself. Okay. From this conference, we were able to identify quite a number of participants who could help us build this book. The idea for the book emerged during the conference. And basically, it turns out that in this conference, we had somebody who articulated and spoke for the optimistic view. That was Justin Yifulin, who in his talk basically presented also the official direction of the government, the basic policies driving a lot of these things. And on the other hand, is an old China hand, Gordon Redding, famous for his studies of the overseas Chinese, who's a retired professor now at INSEAD, and who creates the arguments for why China might not be able to overcome the middle income trap. Okay? Now, I find it interesting, all of 2015, almost any time the Prime Minister gave his speech, he basically makes the point that the future depends on this golden key. Innovation is the golden key. We have to become an innovation economy, innovation society. We must become innovators, and that will be the solution to everything because we'll have entrepreneurship, we'll have new innovation, new knowledge creation, and the economy is just going to just hum just like that. Okay. In chapter 2, Yifulin lays out the basic idea. The chapter here is, of course, a huge harangue and a very deep argument about why the Washington consensus model, in other words, the liberal economics, free markets view, cannot work in China. I don't want to go into that. I want to talk about the mechanism that he talks about how China is going to do that. And the basic policy, the basic idea is to take existing industries and invest in technological upgrading of these industries. Not only does he make that argument, he even proposes very specific criteria as to how you choose the right industry in which to make those investments. And the idea is that the gap between where you are and where you want to go is achievable. It's within your aspiration level. But in this case, I'm talking about the technological aspiration level. So if it's too big and you try to do it, you'll experience failure. If it's too small, you're not going to do much. Something in between. And he articulates it very nicely. And in fact, we already see a huge amount of Chinese companies acquiring other companies around the world. I'll give you a few recent examples here. Some of them I know something about personally. Geely acquisition of Volvo. This is the only company in Beijing Automotive Works, which produces cars in Beijing. All the other guys are, in Chongqing. This is a very interesting case. I want to take a few minutes about it. What BAW did is they acquired the entire intellectual property of the defunct Saab automobile company in Sweden. What do we mean by the IP? They got the engineering manuals. They got all of the stuff that says, here's what we have to do. This is what goes into the kind of steel you have to buy to get this kind of strength, and down to those kind of stuff, okay? Everything. And they also brought to Beijing 150 Saab engineers to help them understand and interpret and maybe explain the IP that they were acquiring. It took over 2 years until they produced the first car. It just came out. Well, in America, we would say it's crap. Car is very poor. I use this example because it illustrates the challenge of technological upgrading by making, for example, acquisition. One of the things that you learn very quickly is that in China, there is something I call the liability of language incompetence. You know, we always talk about when you do FDI and you're going around the world and making investment in other countries, that Americans have liability of foreignness. We don't understand what it means to learn another culture. We just march in, you know, we know everything better. Like Duke University going to Kunshan. I've picked up stories on this Kunshan thing. I'm not allowed to say anything here, of course. It's terrible to criticize our leadership. So this, to me, I know this story in very much detail. It basically helps me understand why the idea of technological upgrading is very good, why it's going to take much longer, and what is the challenges that they need to overcome. And one of the things is it takes them much longer to assimilate, to absorb this knowledge, this IP that they're acquiring. But some people say that in automotive, that probably the gap is already too big. And so they need to do it in a smaller way. Recently, we had in the press China acquisition of Syngenta. That's the second largest seed manufacturer in the world, pesticide manufacturer in the world. It's a Swiss company. Monsanto has been trying to acquire this company. Chen outbid Monsanto by 30%. Who is Chen? It's a state-owned enterprise. A few years earlier, they bought the Italian tire maker Pirelli, and they're on a huge acquisition campaign. Those who study the company can show that these acquisitions have not yet paid off because it takes a long time to sort of know what you got and then use it to integrate into what you're doing or build these new capabilities. And so far, we don't see the payoff, even though in the meantime, Chen has become one of the largest, maybe is the largest, state-owned enterprise in China. And you have to remember that the leadership, and Justin Lewin makes the point that much of this technological upgrading occurs through state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises are the carriers or the implementers of these policies. They have the access to credit, unlimited access to credit from state banks and so forth. However, if they were to be successful, then technological upgrading may in fact be the stepping stone towards eventually also becoming innovators. Because if technological upgrading allows you to catch up with the world's standards, then you have the base from which you can compete on an innovation basis. That's the argument. Gordon Redding, I think, is a well-known China scholar, took a different point of view. He basically observed that historically, there's never been a case where society became a high-income economy without also having to change itself and adopt democratic principles. Now, democratic is not so much to do that you can go to and vote, But democratic principle, or what we call liberal economics, means something about transparency of rules, impartiality, no corruption, all this kind of stuff, and ways by which people can do what they want. And he argues like this, that if you're transforming economy and you're growing, you're building up a middle income class, and the more you have a middle income class, you have many more decisions are being made by individuals, by small groups, by networks, and so forth, which cannot be anticipated and cannot be controlled centrally, because the coordination complexity gets beyond the ability of a center to coordinate. So it's an argument about the failure of coordination, or the inability of the center to coordinate, when in fact you have so many players, you allow so many players to be in the system and build up the system. But for the players to be able to do that, you have to play by certain rules, transparency, fairness, and so forth. So he argues that as long as the CCP wants to stay in power and control everything from the top down, then that basically dooms China from being able to do that. So you got both sides of the story. So the question is, can China become a high-income economy, an innovation economy, by maintaining the centrality and the control of this Communist Party, by continuing to do business on the basis of personalism? I'll come back to that, but personalism means that there's an absence of institutional trust, and they're not going to build up institutional trust, or will not be able to replicate an institutional trust system of the type that we never stop to think about it. You know, it's like automatic in a democratic society. Okay, I've given you the two extremes. We then are trying to fill in the various pieces here, partly, you know, serendipitous. Michael Veit happens to be married to a Korean woman, and for some other reasons has become has been immersing himself in studying various business systems, and he studied Japan, and he studied Korea, and also he and Gordon Redding have the Oxford University Handbook on business systems. And his analysis of Korea basically is like this. Korea is probably the best model for China. Why? Because in 1970, when Chung-hee Park became the dictator of Korea, at that time, Korea was the poorest economy in the world. Rural, agricultural, inefficient, terrible. And in less than 20 years, Chung-hee Park takes Korea from nothing to a powerhouse, an industrial economy. Of course, he gets ousted after 20 years because of his dictatorship. And what do the Koreans put in place? Democracy. And ever since, we've seen how the Koreans are elaborating on their form of democracy. And you know, we may not think sometimes that it's like ours. It's a form of democracy, and is very much responsible for how the population is able to find all kinds of ways to move up in the respective sectors. The other thing that you cannot do in China that Chung-hee Park did is that Chung-hee Park copied the Zaibatsu system in Japan before World War II. So he created chaebols, and the whole idea was that chaebols become their own economies. They compete with one another fiercely. The state can play a little bit of favoritism. They say, okay, you're this chaebol, you're the SK, I'm going to give you SK Telecom, after the son of the founder of SK married his daughter. Things like this happen. But the point is that chaebols are competing with one another, self-contained economies, and so you have a huge flowering of innovation, of competition, of new products, and all this kind of stuff. And you know, when I used to go to Korea, I used to teach the LG electronics people about management, organization, stuff like that. And one of the things we talked about is the innovation process. You know, I'd come back from the next year, and they would say to me, oh yeah, we can now introduce a new cell phone every 12 weeks. But then somebody in the group put his hand up and said, yeah, but you know, Samsung is doing it in 8 weeks. Just to illustrate the kind of competition that the Chibol structure created that is very much responsible for the unbelievable industrial growth of China, of Korea. Well, he argues that basically China cannot duplicate this particular model. Okay? In addition, it is hampered by a lot of the conditions that in corruption and so forth that basically work against achieving what Korea was able to do. But still, Korea is a good model. Kun Lee basically contributes to Li Fulin's idea about technological upgrading by providing an argument as to what kind of industries to select. His basic argument is that you need to select industries that you're in them, as Li Fulin argues, but they have to be fast cycle industries. If they're developing slowly, then it will be too long to be able to catch up. So, Doug Fuller is an interesting American. I don't know why he's not a faculty member in some good university in the United States, but I'm not going to go there. He's at Zhejiang University. I don't know how many of you know Zhejiang University. Zhejiang is the top science technology university in China. It is away from the center, which gives it a little bit more freedom to do things. Let me back up here for a second. You know, these provinces in the south, Zhejiang and Fujian and so forth, there are three provinces there that even during the time of the emperors were always considered to be renegade provinces. And we'll want to come back to it later. So in a way, if you're Zhejiang and you're in this province, sometimes you play by different rules than Qinghua is to play. You know, that's right there in Beijing under the control of the CCP. His argument was, it's not an argument, he basically goes through a long litany of transaction cost barriers. The approval processes, the conflict between the different ministries, the conflict between what goes on in Beijing and what happens at the province level, and why it takes so long to get approval for something, why you have to constantly allocate people to maintain relationship with the local government, with the central government, with particular departments and so forth, and how all of these things basically distort the process by which incentives are created, you have access to capital or to bank loans at the state banks and so forth. And basically he argues if they don't solve this problem, then it's not going to work. Okay? Kan Huang is also at Zhejiang University. He's been studying innovation. He's mainly been focusing on patenting. Because back there in the 2 5-year plans ago, the government had the idea, oh yeah, we have to stimulate innovation, so we should reward the application for patents. Well, you know, the incentives were in place, and the people in the state-owned enterprises, the people in the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and so forth, are now scrambling to file patents. Well, their own studies a few years ago showed that most of these patents were worthless. Not only that, they also created a class of patents called utility patents, which is like process patents. And Huang actually takes us through the story as to how this led to this huge invention process and patenting process, and they came to the conclusion that it actually did not create new knowledge, it did not advance technology, but they all got their incentives. You know, the state-owned enterprise, you know, checked off the box at the end of the year, and they got, you guys are in the military, you know what I mean, and that's the way it went. So this chapter is about that, but it's also a chapter about the emergence of the new IP system to make it possible to own IP and to be registered and what it means. And something you're probably not familiar with, but in China you can have a patent issued in Beijing that covers all of China, but every province and autonomous region can also approve patents. And I remember when I was studying the transformation of Wuxi, one of the entrepreneurs who I was induced to, got an offer he couldn't refuse to come from Atlanta to to Wuxi explained to me that one of the things that the Wuxi government promised him is that when he files for a patent, it's a use patent, use, U-S-E, and another company in another province would copy his patent, that they would undertake the effort to negate this violation of his patent in another province. Yep, I'm going to wrap it up. Okay. So this gives us a story about what the challenge it will be just to develop a patent system that will enable knowledge creation. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I just want to point out that John Child, another very famous organization theorist and strategy, contributes to this chapter, this book, by pointing out that there's another opportunity, a huge opportunity, if the Chinese and other transforming economies could focus on the ecology of small, medium enterprise and stimulate innovation, product creation, and so forth at that level. And we'll leave it at that. Eves Dawes and Keeley Wilson basically point out that we now have Chinese multinational enterprises. They're going out there and acquiring companies that are trying to compete abroad, and that their basic challenge is the same one that we used to talk about American companies going abroad. Insensitivity to cross-cultural differences, all the stuff that you have to learn. So the liability of foreigners that Western companies had doing FDI is now the same problem that the Chinese MNEs have. There are two cases here. The case on the left is an example of this initiative, a central initiative to create a capability. In other words, this was an initiative that China IT outsourcing industry should leapfrog India. Not a big example. Unfortunately, it was a total failure, and this case is about how and what explains the failure of the development of the IT outsourcing industry in China. I also studied that in a separate study, and let's put it this way. The gap between where you are and where you have to be in order to compete with the Indians was too great. This chapter just points out that because China often uses the same model. We want to do something, then we designate X number of cities to be model cities, whether it's for free economic zones, the old Shenzhen story, Guangdong, and so forth, or in this case, 25 cities who will become the hubs for attracting the outsourcing industry. Is there a model? Yes, they have a model. Dalian is a very successful, very, very successful example of IT outsourcing, but the clients are not Western clients. The clients are either Japanese or Korean. Why? Because in Dalian, there's still a very large population that speaks very good Japanese, and a smaller population, but still very large, that speaks Korean. So the Japanese have their own problems, right? Declining population, aging population, there are not enough people, so they move administrative work, back office work to Dalian. These Chinese-speaking Japanese are very good at doing this, and it's very successful. It's a similar story in Korea. So the Dalian model was not the right model to look at. The gap was way too big. And the cities used the same model that they used for attracting industries. They build your factories, they give you tax incentives, all kinds of stuff like that, which is not what you need when you're trying to build a technology-based capability. Where you have to train people, you have to learn about ISO standards, you have to get these enterprises to satisfy the ISO standards because the international clients are not going to give you the business unless you checked off all the 9 relevant ISO standards. Because that's what you have in this chapter. I'm going to not even go into all of this, but these are the organization level issues. Why Chinese companies are not innovation, cannot be creative, and the problem of the university level and these kind of stuff, we're just going to forget about that. Okay. We end up the book not by saying that China will or will not succeed. What we're saying is, my personal belief, by the way, is that if pragmatism continues to be the last action, so the way I'm thinking about it, like 1978, for pragmatic reason, China adopts the opening of the economy, the liberalization of the economy. Yeah, it couldn't get any worse, right? So let's do something else. If you actually read Deng Xiaoping's speech, he says, it's quoted in one of my papers, he says, and we're very lucky, he says. We have one city in China that is a model for liberalization. Any of you know which city this was? Wenzhou. Wenzhou is a city that he names. Wenzhou was a trading city. They even had script money. So the same thing is going to repeat itself here. We need now some examples to show that within our system we already have that. And who are those cities? Shenzhen, startup capital, one of the two startup capitals of China. Hangzhou, another startup capital. Shenzhen is in software and computers and stuff like that. Hangzhou is in engineering companies and stuff like that. Question is, are they going to make the reform that will allow this to be replicated across China? And what we do is say, okay, the next project. Here are criteria. You can start tracking these things. For each one of them, you can create an index, a way of collecting the data, and see whether, in fact, China is moving up on these dimensions, because that would be an indication of the progress of moving toward a higher valuated economy. I know I'm out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
The microphone here, if anyone has a question.
Sir, do you believe that the CCP will become more proactive in attempting to reclaim some of China's intellectual property by, I suppose, stealing back students that it allows to go to like the United States or Europe for college, but then they end up living there instead of actually coming back to China? And if so, how do you believe they'll either incentivize that or legalize that in order to ensure that that intellectual property and that intellectual capital is reclaimed by the Chinese state?
This is a very, very, very good question. In fact, I wrote an article about that called The Diaspora of Talent, where we talk about China. I also have a chapter in the handbook about this. Okay, so the answer is this. Actually, they're putting a lot of effort into reversing the brain drain. The difficulty is, let's say if you're in my field, you're a professor, and you get attracted to one of the top universities, or maybe not the top university, maybe number 30, like Wuhan. And Wuhan's number 10, but anyway, it's some other university. What's the problem? The problem is that I get conditions of employment that makes everybody around me envious. Therefore, they don't talk to me, they don't work with me, I don't have the network on which to continue, so that I say, oh, the hell with it, I'm going back to Duke. And in fact, that's been one of the biggest problems that they've had. Whether you get the job in the National Academy of Sciences or National Academy of Engineering, they have not solved this problem yet. It's really a very difficult problem to deal with. And on the one hand, you're right, about 4 million Chinese are outside of China with good education and good capabilities. On the other hand, getting them back or finding the solution, the cultural, institutional integration solution is really a challenge. They're working very hard on this, few successes. But you're right, that would help a lot.
Thanks for your talk. Jane Goodall recently made a statement that China is exploiting Africa like a colonial power. I guess my question would be, it makes sense that they're acquiring companies like Saab and Pirelli. It seems like they're playing the long game, acquiring resources, and then, the industry to push them. I guess my question is, how is the growing professional class in Africa outside of China contributing to the middle class economy? And how is the acquisition of African properties and resources? How do you see that as innovation?
Well, I think your point is excellent, and also it's true. In other words, think about what China is doing. I didn't talk about some of these things, but think about what they've become best in. Okay, they're best in railroads. They're best in construction. When the California faced the problem of rebuilding the Bay Bridge, it was a Chinese company that got the contract. Why? Because, you know, in China have built so many roads, so many dams, so many bridges. These construction companies become best in the world in doing things like that, and they have lower costs. Now you have become so good in railroads, and believe me, I've taken the bullet train from Moscow to St. Petersburg last April. It was, you know, it says it's going to go 258 kilometers per hour. It never went over 110. Okay? So who's going to build the next railroads in Russia? These deals have been signed between Putin and President Xi. Now they're saying to themselves, look, we need to find a way to get mineral resources, petroleum from countries in Africa. We will trade, we will build roads and infrastructure for you, and it's in a way a replication of the colonial model. You didn't use this term, but that's basically what's going on. And they don't do it with African workers. Mostly it also requires the use of the Chinese workers that they bring with them. The deal in California was, yes, they're going to use American workers, but if you were there when the bridge was being reconstructed, there were all these little trailer parks where all these Chinese were living in after work. Okay, so I think you're right. Will it affect them negatively? Probably. But you have to think again from a China point of view. They don't have petroleum. They have to import petroleum. There are all kinds of other resources they don't have. They must make deals which allow them to do this. And the whole notion of rebuilding the Silk Road is, okay, we're going to have to sell junk someplace else because it cannot go to the West anymore. And so the Silk Road allows them to sell in Kazakhstan all the stands and eventually also go to Moscow. I mean, and these are big projects, and only China has the resources to invest in these kind of infrastructure projects, and they have the knowledge. I mean, if you think about the Three Gorges River Dam, finally I went to see it this last October. It is an amazing engineering feat. It's an amazing experiment in social reengineering, because they had to move 2.5 million people from their villages along the Yangtze River and relocate them and repopulate them and re-educate them and make them feel good, while at the same time solving some of the most difficult engineering problems in the world that I don't believe there's any company in the United States that could build that bridge. I mean, the dam. So thank you for your question. This is one of these, you know, black marks. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you, Professor. Oh, well, one more question.
One more question. Good.
So, again, thank you. It's very nice when someone that talk about China in this case has actually been there and knows really from close what's happening abroad. My question is about like innovation and technology. So, if I got it right, one of your points is that Chinese think that being able in being good at innovation will kind of be solving their problem on getting out of the middle income trap. So we've been talking about buying out companies from abroad, and that will help China to get some of the intelligence, let's say, some of the good things that are happening abroad. We've been talking about the brain drain, trying to reverse the brain drain. I was thinking about, like, are in China investing on social capital or building better universities, better education there, trying to build from inside that knowledge that they lack to be good at technology innovation. Thank you.
Well, you know, you put your finger on another very good set of issues. Keep in mind what the model is. The model is first to do technological upgrade. In Beijing, the people are concerned with these things and do not want to have to say, I'm going to be like Google. Even though Alibaba does do Google kind of thing. But remember that Alibaba could never be what they were if the Chinese government did not exclude companies like Google and Microsoft to come in and play in China. Okay? So that was a deliberate industrial policy type thing, and Alibaba is an amazing company. But when we talk about innovation, they have the same problem that the United States has had, and they use the very similar strategies that the Western world has used. They have right now in process 16 mega projects. One of them is this new telescope that is going to, be the most important telescope. They're in conversation with the people who would like to have the ability to do the kind of experiment in CERN, Switzerland, but on a higher level, and only China might have the money to actually build one of these things. And my wife's nephew is one of these scientists that keeps negotiating this thing. Okay? But to become an innovation society, the first thing you have to do is you have to think about education. The problem is, we talk about in the book I did not mention today, the problem is, how do you create competition between universities in the way you teach, do research, and so forth, when the Ministry of Education has to approve any? Why did it take us so long to keep going in Kunshan? Because it took us 2 years to discover that nothing is going to happen until we find a shadow partner who can take us to the Ministry of Education, and we have to satisfy all of the requirements, bureaucratic requirements of the Ministry of Education. High level, they said, yes, we want American universities to come to China and show new models of universities. But in everyday actions, we had to satisfy every bureaucratic hurdle along the way. Therefore, innovation becomes very difficult. Now, the interesting thing is the Chinese talk a lot about this. And in fact, the author of the reform policies for universities is a guy named Zhuolan. He's actually got his training at Carnegie. So now he's in my Carnegie Mafia network. That's one of the things about coming out of Carnegie. And he's the Dean of Public Administration, Tsinghua, and very high up in the Communist Party, all of these things. And after we're off time, we're away someplace, definitely away from the offices, it's a different conversation about what it takes to do this. Why is it? Because most of us did not know that the Ministry of Education is responsible to the Chinese Communist Party to maintain the ideology. If you go to a Chinese university, next to every office dean, every provost, there is another office, and it's called the party secretary. The party secretary. And so here you have a situation where on the one they know exactly what they need to do, but how to work this inside is one of the barriers. I'm sorry I didn't talk about this, but we discussed it. Excellent question.
Thank you, Professor Lewin. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.